This is a quote from the fantasy novel Legend from 1984, the first book in the Drenai series by David Gemmell.
Apparently I was pronouncing his name weird. I double-checked, and as it turns out, everyone says Gemmell.
One of my all-time favorite fantasy authors. I read it almost 20 years ago at this point, and this always stuck with me. Not because it's earth-shatteringly profound and revealed something about the nature of our reality, but just because it's interesting and because I hadn't seen that sort of sentiment before at that time. Especially in epic, heroic fantasy, it wasn't common to really describe fight scenes in a down-to-earth way. So, the quote is, "No matter how high the skill, a contest between an axeman and a swordsman could never last long." What I like about that is that you don't even really know how it's meant. It could mean that the swordsman has a substantial advantage, it could mean that the axeman has an advantage, or it could mean that it's just extremely dangerous for both. And that's what I think. If you like the grittier kind of fantasy, that's a little bit more realistic, even though there are mystical elements, you would probably enjoy that. I mean, I don't know how well it's aged for me personally because it's been so long, but I greatly enjoyed it back then, and it was unusual. The heroes do not come back quickly from being slashed or otherwise wounded. It takes a while, so it's a long, arduous healing process, and the running gag for me is always, everything needs stitches. Cut with a knife, stitches. Glancing bolt to the arm, stitches. Claw swipe to the face, stitches. And he mentions how many, too. Characters spend a significant amount of time in recovery, and you might think that's boring, but no. So if you like that kind of stuff, you would definitely enjoy David Gemmell's work. Sadly, he passed away all too young, so there are only so many novels, but yeah, give him a try. Although one thing I would recommend is skip the epilogue. He had a way of screwing over characters you like all the way at the end. Not even during the main story, but during the epilogue, he would casually drop something like, "Oh yeah, the main character's love interest, she died falling from a horse." It's like, what? Don't do that, man. Anyway, so Legend is about Druss the Legend, a warrior with a double-bitted axe, Snaga the Sender. Back then, I didn't particularly like double axes because that was early on when I just started to, pluck apart every cliche and every unrealistic thing. I was like, oh, that's bullshit. I've mellowed out a little bit since then, as you may know. But even then, Snaga was cool. I couldn't argue with that. The way it's described, the way he uses it. Anyway, if you ask me, axes are underrated, underrepresented, and often mischaracterized, because they're often shown as sort of brutish weapons that require no skill, only strength. You just hack and chop until it's done. And that's not really accurate. Of course, they can be used that way, but any weapon requires skill, of course, in a fight. Whether it be unarmed or armed with whatever really, from a dagger to a polearm, to a firearm even, everything takes skill. Quite a bit of skill, in fact. And if your opponent has more than you do, you're in trouble. You can compensate with a better weapon, or a farther reaching or easier to use weapon, or you can compensate with superior fitness, strength and speed and agility and all that. But even with just an axe, as peasant-like as it may seem, there's plenty of skill involved. Especially if you think of a poleaxe, it's not called knightly poleaxe for nothing. It was wielded with great skill. But either way, obviously swordsmanship also requires great skill. In some ways, more skill, at least when it comes to cutting. If you mess up a little bit and the edge isn't aligned quite right, a cut can be, depending on the sword, either moderately effective or not do a whole lot. With an axe, on the other hand, even lightly tapping something with a sharp axe will do damage, and putting your back into it will do horrifying amounts of damage. You really have to go big to rival the destructive power of an axe with a sword. And a dull axe compared to a dull sword, or if going up against armor that can't be cut through with either weapon, the axe is going to be much more effective than the sword. Anyway, this is not about the pros and cons of axes compared to swords. I'm pretty sure I've already made a video about that, linked in the description below, unless I have a phantom memory right now. This is more about the dynamic of an axeman versus a swordsman. Why might it end quickly? The short and simple answer is because it is indeed exceptionally dangerous for both. More dangerous than an armed fight normally is, which is plenty. But in that case, it's even worse. Why? Because an axe, as said, is extremely powerful and very difficult to defend against with a sword. The sword is quicker and more agile, but it can struggle to defend effectively against the axe for a number of reasons. Just sheer power, it may be difficult to stop it with a sword blade, so you may have to try to redirect it, which isn't always easy. And also because the axe head sticks out quite a bit in front of the haft, so it can be difficult to defend against that. It can sometimes sneak around the defense, things like that. But on the other hand, it's also a bit more difficult to defend with the axe against the sword. For one, because the hands are awfully exposed. And I like that Druss actually wears gauntlets in the novel. That's smart. Now, that's an issue we shouldn't overstate, because hands are always awfully exposed in armed combat, even with swords, unless you're wearing something like a basket-hilted sword or heavy gauntlets. And by that I mean mitten-style gauntlets, as opposed to fingered gauntlets, which don't do all that much to protect your fingers from being broken. So with an axe, it's also a good idea to wear heavy gauntlets, or just be very mindful of it. There are just a few more ways in which the hands can be targeted. Another difference is axes can hook and control quite well. Against another axe or polearm that goes both ways, where your own weapon can also be controlled more easily, but the sword can't do that. It doesn't have the right mass distribution, and it doesn't hook very well, unlike the axe. Let me just pester you for a moment with a little self-promotion. This year I've had very few sponsorships, and not due to a lack of offers, it's just that 95% of them go right in the spam folder. I'm rather picky with that. So I have to rely more on patrons and working with companies on an affiliate basis. So if you are feeling generous and would like to support the channel, you can sign up on Patreon or via YouTube memberships. Aside from the warm, fuzzy feeling you get from being a VIP who's directly contributing to securing the future of the channel, you also get bonus content. Depending on the tier, that can be longer ad-free edits of videos or entirely new videos, usually behind-the-scenes stuff and vlogs, and also live streams and access to an exclusive Discord server. Other than that, you can also support the channel while getting cool stuff for yourself through my affiliate links, like Cult of Athena, of course, and gamer subs. Personally, I'm quite fond of the sus bars. And if, like me, you don't hydrate as well in just plain water, these drink powders come in handy in a boatload of different flavors. Personally, I quite like the lychee one, although guacamole gamer fart, as unappealing as it sounds, is pretty good too. They come in caffeinated and uncaffeinated. And I'll leave you be now. That's enough shameless self-promotion. Thrusts with a sword blade can sometimes be difficult to defend against with an axe, but the kicker about that is, even if you manage to nail an opponent with an axe with your sword thrust, you might still have your head split in two, because thrusts don't have high stopping power, so there's a good chance, even if it's fatal, there's a good chance that the opponent still has enough juice in them to finish you off with the axe. All that, of course, is assuming the axe doesn't break. You know, if the handle is reinforced, perhaps, or could even be an all-steel haft, things like that, then you're good. Otherwise, if it's just plain wood, repeated strikes will eventually weaken it to the point where it can easily break, even though the sword's not going to cut through in one swing if it's halfway decent wood. But all that, either way, doesn't quite apply if both have a shield. Now it's much more equal. Now I could see the fight going on a little bit longer, because the issue of having difficulty defending doesn't apply quite as well. Now, I would say the axe is better against a shield than the sword is, but the sword still has the advantage in speed and agility, mitigated by the shield in the hand of the axe user, so that's not as big of a discrepancy. I guess nowadays it wouldn't necessarily be as unusual to see that kind of realism in a fantasy novel, but I had different expectations back then. So it impressed me quite a bit that a fantasy author would think about this at all and would spend any kind of mental effort on elements of realism. Even if it's not perfectly realistic, at least considering that at all. So yeah, two-handed axe versus two-handed sword is definitely high stakes. Maybe not as high stakes as Van Helsing versus Dracula. That was terrible. Anyway, let me know what you think, what some of your favorite fantasy authors are, and maybe any particular quotes that stuck with you for whatever reason. I'm done yapping. Hope you enjoyed it. Take care, folks. You know, it doesn't have to be touching grass. Touching rock and smelling sea air is even better.